a little bit more about the Planning Association of Washington. And Amy's prompting me to remember to say that our meeting is going to be recorded. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment on my next slide. So it looks like our number has sort of settled around 30 people joining us right now. So I think I will start clicking through some slides. So as I've mentioned, you're in the right spot if you're here for a Planning Association of Washington webinar on tiny homes and Appendix Q. I think in a perfect world, we would have said tiny homes, tiny houses, and tiny homes on wheels. And we'll be hearing a little bit about definitions as we move throughout the day. But, you know, long titles are tough to read. So I'll stick with tiny homes and Appendix Q for right now. We are using Zoom today and we'll be in Zoom meetings. So we are going to ask that you please stay muted when you're not asking a question or intentionally participating in the webinar. We want to make sure to be respectful of our speakers and not accidentally be talking over them. As you just probably heard the announcement, this meeting is being recorded. We do share the link with people who were registered for the event, but unable to attend. And then this one has actually proved very popular. So maybe we'll post it on our website as well, you know, as the year goes on. I've already mentioned if you could edit your name to match your registration. It's one of the ways that we're asked to confirm, especially if you're going to use this for continuing ed credits for your AICP certification. We need to be able to confirm that you attended. And we are going to have time for questions. We'll also have a little bit of a break during our webinar today because we are together for 2 hours. So we do want to have a self-care break about halfway through. But we are going to have specific times for questions. So if you've got a burning question that's coming up while one of the speakers is sharing, we're going to invite you to post that in the chat rather than busting in on our speakers. Part of that is because we are going to have some shared screens with some PowerPoint slides. So we want to make sure that when you're posting a question, we're actually seeing it. So if you just raised your hand, our speakers aren't likely going to be able to see that. And then you'll also see on this slide, if you need tech support assistance today, for instance, if you're not hearing me now and I'm just a head that's moving around and looking very excited, you can email Amy, who's the PAW Executive Director, and she's available at the email address on your screen. I want to take a moment to acknowledge our annual sponsors as we launch into our webinar. We're always excited to partner with both the Washington State Department of Ecology and Washington State Department of Commerce. Both Commerce and Ecology offer their own training series throughout the year. So if you are not already signed up for their email notifications where they share those opportunities, we would certainly suggest you do so. And we're always grateful for their support. LDC, which is a planning consultant firm, is also one of our sponsors, and then the Washington County Risk Pool Association, a sponsor as well. And I think sometimes they offer scholarships at a few of our events, so maybe you're using one of those scholarships today. I've already mentioned that we want you to change your name so it matches your registration name, and that's specifically so that we can confirm you for CM information. So if you are an AICP certified planner or you need to get education credits for another association, you'll want to make sure that you're confirming that registration. And we already have CMs for this confirmed, so you get 2 CMs and the event number is here, but you can also just look it up by the title of the event when you go to APA. And then finally, I'll introduce myself a little more fully. My name is Mary Reinbold. I serve as a senior planner at the Department of Commerce, and my specialty is on the multifamily property tax exemption, transit-oriented development, and also special housing types in HB 1220, which includes permanent supportive housing, transitional housing, emergency shelter, and emergency housing. I have a background in working with various nonprofits in the Spokane area, and I'm actually coming to you from Spokane today. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that Commerce is a great place to work. Not that we ever want you to leave your employer, but if you're looking for employment, we have tons of jobs open in every division. So come on over, we'd be happy to have you. I'm also serving in my second term as a PAW board member. My focus is on providing educational opportunities. So if you ever have feedback about events that we've provided or have ideas of future events that you'd like to see, I'm the right point of contact. I would love to hear that. We're particularly interested in finding a really spooky topic to host in October. So maybe you know all about like human remains composting or cemetery planning or the connection between walkability and trick-or-treating. I want to hear from you because we really want to have a fun October together hosting a spooky topic. I have some cheat sheet notes here to help me introduce our speakers, so pardon my screen blip there. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today. First, I'll introduce Micah, which Micah, I mean, your beard is a little longer in this picture. I mean, maybe this is the COVID growth, right? Micah has over 25 years of experience working on all aspects of building services management and code development. He is the technical code development manager for Seattle's Department of Construction and Inspection, where he and his team develop and publish all of Seattle's construction codes. Woo! And as if that wasn't enough to do, today, Micah is joining us primarily in his role as a member of the Washington Association of Building Officials, or WABO, which is one of my favorite abbreviations to throw around, a member of their executive board and chair of their technical code development committee. He's been a member of several international code councils, code development committees over the last two development cycles or code development cycles. And Micah was appointed by Governor Inslee as a member of the Washington State Building Code Council representing code officials. And he is a self-described code nerd, which I am all about people embracing that nerd label. I'm definitely a planning nerd. The second speaker I have the pleasure of introducing is Todd McKellips. Todd is the founder and executive director of the Washington Tiny House Association, and he's got like banners and a cool t-shirt on. So I'm really, the theming is strong with Todd. He's bringing good vibes to our Friday the 13th webinar, right? Todd has been involved in construction and permitting since 1996, and he built his first tiny home in 2013. Todd is the CEO of Seattle Tiny Homes, Inc., and a partner in True Land Development, a general contracting firm in Washington, which specializes in manufactured housing communities, RV parks, and tiny home communities. And in February of 2022, they opened their first tiny home on wheels community in Puyallup, Washington. That was a lot of detail in there. I think I need a breath. Todd is the lead expert in Whatcom County working on adapting Appendix Q for the Tiny Home Industry Association. And Todd also works on teaching plan approval practices on behalf of L&I. So we've really got the experts virtually in the room with us today, and I'm so glad that they're here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Todd is going to be our first speaker today. So Todd, if you have some slides that you want to share, now is your time. If you don't see the option at the bottom of your screen, it should be showing up as a green up arrow in a box, or rather a black up arrow in a green box. You've got it. All right, well, take it away, Todd, and I'll be monitoring the chat.
Awesome. Thank you for doing this today, Mary, and for breathing out all those words. I do apologize. Micah is the man himself, and I'm happy to be here presenting this big, huge passion of affordable housing and trying to come up with our own style housing has been quite the experience. As Mike is aware too, just with the State Building Council and all of that, adapting this wasn't necessarily the easiest, and but at the same time exciting to have something else to present to folks. So yeah, basically I believe we're going right into what a tiny home might be. And that goes right down to why we're here, and that is Senate Bill 5383 was passed in 2019 there, that basically this is what the bill says, that a tiny house or tiny house with wheels means a dwelling to be used as permanent housing with the permanent provisions for living, sleeping, eating, cooking, and sanitation built in accordance with the state building code, which we'll all hear from Micah on this. But we want to go into what's a tiny home or what's a tiny house. There's kind of a different variation of what those are according to the RCWs and what the state considers a home or a house. Tiny home per se would be an RV. It's anything being used as a primary dwelling unit with sleeping, bathing, eating facilities as well. It could also be per se a homeless shelter village like the Wording Veterans Village, which I'm on the board of. And then there's the second category of what Micah and I will be talking about too, is a tiny house, which is built in Washington and is inspected by LNI. It could also be built out of state and inspected by LNI. They do have inspectors fly to other states and actually inspect other builds as they're happening. I wanted to kind of bring in at this point another slide. Let me do another share just of what we're working on with Whatcom County, because it is so crazy what a tiny house could be. As you can see, each one of these columns, Whatcom County's done a lot of work on deciphering what that is, whether it's a site-built home, a site-built tiny home, Whatcom County movable tiny home, which it would be CBO approved. Then they have the categories of what they have right now, which is a manufactured mobile home greater than 400 square feet. And then the discussion of factory built modular tiny house on wheels, which is in accordance with that Senate Bill 5383. And then they went on and talk about something that which I'm really passionate about, which is the movable tiny home, which is more or less built to more of an RV ANSI code, 119.2 or a 119.5, which is a park model RV style code, but it's consistent with Senate Bill 5383. We can follow methodologies in the state and build to an RV code, but we use spray foam insulation. We use different products that bring that R factor into the new energy codes and make sure that unit is built to the IRC code as well. But it's more on wheels, more temporary, more allowed to be moved into mobile home RV park kind of thing, and then moved to a backyard per se someday. So they went on to, in a column H, park model trailer ANSI 119.5, which has a 12-foot max. So they have their park models, but then they have more of the tiny home park models per se. And then the recreational vehicle category, which if you look at it, every one of those talks about which ones will meet IRC standards, which doesn't, which meets a HUD standard. I'll go ahead and share this with Amy later, to pass out as well, and Mary, if anybody asks for this. There's a lot of work that they went into doing on this. Go ahead, Mary.
Todd, I'm going to jump in just really quick because I know what CBO approved means, and I'm also familiar with ANSI standards, but not everybody's going to be familiar with acronyms. So,
me either.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll drop some in the chat, but just as we move forward, I do know a few people on the call with us just aren't too familiar with those abbreviations.
Sure. Yeah, feel free to jump in anytime. And I've been jumping into this head first, and a lot of stuff is like, when we're talking about the actual Senate Bill 5383, when it's describing, property and all the definitions there, it's all Greek to me sometimes. I've been learning, but so I'm going to go back to here, and I'll share that later. But going into tiny house or tiny house community, that's Senate Bill 5383 also described. Tiny house communities means real property rented out or held in rent for others for the placement of tiny houses on wheels, or tiny houses utilizing the binding site plan process in RCWs. And it goes on, and put the page 7 and all that in there. So they could be, put on the ground on cement foundations like that picture there, or it could be a tiny home on wheels community. There's a lot of openness to what that could look like, whether it's a mobile home park style, RV park style, or actual stick built on foundation structures there. And then, going into also what's a tiny house. The Senate Bill 5383 did put in there, city, town, and now county may not adopt an ordinance that, can affect or directly, indirectly affect discrimination against customers' choices of placement. So at the Washington Tiny House Association, we really like this being in there because it basically opens the door to allowing this on a broader scale, right? Tiny homes on wheels were looked at before in a per se negative manner. It was short term and not legal per se. And this bill really established that open door to making it legal for us tiny home dwellers. But it basically brings in the concept of site-built homes, factory-built homes, and most tiny homes on wheels will be considered factory-built or LNI inspected, that kind of standard. And I thought that was probably one of the most important things. And then we're going into the purpose of Senate Bill 5383. I just kind of wanted to break it down from the association when we proposed the bill to Senator Zeiger, and he ran with it. And that was really to adapt the Appendix Q foundation standards that came directly out of federal regulatory standards, where some tiny home people were pushing on that we needed something that considered a trailer foundation to be a legal foundation, that someone didn't need to tie it down to another cement foundation per se. So that Appendix Q kind of left the door open. There's still people that will argue with that, whether that has been that the purpose of Appendix Q is to say that, but when it was asked, does this include a trailer foundation, we were told yes. So the state of Washington found that very important to adapt that standard to allow for development on a trailer chassis frame that would be meant for permanent habitation. Created a pathway for everybody from WABO, the State Building Council, and LNI to provide a legal pathway for contractors to build one, for do-it-yourselfers to build one. And also local jurisdictions, like with Whatcom County, Zach Giffen from Tiny House Nation lives up there, and he's very big on can the city itself do the inspections. He wants to see that happen and kind of let LNI do their thing, but also the city could have plans pre-approved per se and let them build. But the big thing was safety. I'm a former firefighter myself, just making sure that if someone was going to build one of these, nightmare is one of them, driving down the road and obliterating I-5. We just don't want to see that happen. And then the third point here is to legalize tiny home RVs and living in a tiny home on wheels within the state of Washington. There are so many people in fear of being removed and getting letters from code enforcement that folks were just hounding me every day, like, what can we do to legalize people living in a unit like that? So this created a pathway for tiny house communities as well. There was a lot of homeless shelter communities getting started, veterans communities, and none of which were added into code. People were breaking the rules to allow them, and this created a pathway for them to do that. And then it added tiny houses and to manufactured housing communities as well. I manage a RV park, a mobile home park myself, and there was room to develop, and there were septic tanks sitting there in a flood zone, and we could take advantage of them, right? And so it created a pathway for that to happen, and that's why the first Puyallup community is in existence now, 12 spaces, and we're excited to be filling them as we speak. But it removed barriers to housing and discrimination for tiny homes on wheels. That was a huge celebration for us. And then also removed the liabilities from schools or nonprofits if they were going to manufacture one for a homeless individual. there was this whole thing that where they were just sitting on these houses for an extended amount of time without being able to disperse them to actually let someone live in it because of the liability factor of that unit. So by working with LNI now, the school, high school could go build one. They would work with Micah, LNI, and WABO and everybody to build that legally and to build it up to code. So establish that process. And then Mary, I don't know if I'm talking too fast, but we're going to talk about 2001, which just passed just recently this year. The first bill did talk about counties as far as mobile home parks and stuff like that, but then in different sections it focused more on cities and towns. So a lot of the counties kind of were saying, we don't have anything to do with this. We're not really responsible. But the 2001 added the county language into those different sections, so that they didn't feel exempt from Senate Bill 5383 language. And then it really ratified some funding access to eliminate impact fees and permit fees and stuff like that for communities that were developing specifically for affordable housing concepts. So that's been exciting, but it also just provided pathways to increase development for tiny homes because of that, right? You're incentivizing developers. Tiny homes by far are probably the lowest, most affordable building mechanism we have. When I first got into affordable housing, I was in manufactured homes. Couldn't find places to develop. It was very much looked down upon to develop that. And tiny homes by far, I'll let Micah talk about that, but they're built way better than a mobile home. You don't have settling issues like a manufactured home. They're built with better products and more like a stick-built house that is going to be very structurally sound for the next 50 to 100 years. And it's remodelable compared to a manufactured home, which I don't know about you, but I've renovated a few of those and I can't build, they're built with ticky-tacky. It's quite amazing. So other information that I would consider very important to be talking about when we talk about these issues, there's a lot of folks that will talk about RVs and how that RV certified tiny home per se from another builder would not be under the same tiny house code, but that Senate Bill 5383 created the language that we need for it. But then I want to talk about minimum floor space requirements. Some towns and some cities in Washington still have a minimum floor space requirement. And I want to bring it up that House Bill 1085 in 2018 removed any minimum floor space requirement for construction and residential. That was the first step we needed to create a pathway for tiny homes and tiny housing. A huge celebration, but there are some places that have not followed that process yet. And I want to bring that up just because it's very important to look at that. It is RCW, it is law in Washington state not to have a minimum floor space requirement. Governor Inslee did partially veto that bill, and he recommended that a 65 minimum for people's mental health, and I agree with him. Going too small is too small, even for a homeless individual or whatever. So let's give them a safe, comfortable home. But then also in 2018, a King County Superior Court judge ruled on an impound issue that the city violated a Homestead Act ruling with a person that was living in a vehicle and being used as a primary dwelling unit in Washington. So that trickled down to even my manufactured housing community, my RV park, where our lawyers are telling us now we have to provide 1-year leases to individuals with RVs who are living in them permanently. Which really opened up the door for people that are in RV tiny houses per se. They're certified RVs, but they basically created a pathway to where there's no 180-day limit now. There's no limitation on staying in those kind of units, and the court action caused the state of Washington to remove the 180-day issue out of the RCW. So right now, if you look at the operative language of the Homestead Act ruling, it does say real or personal property that the owner used as a residence. It is in there, and it is pretty certain, in our opinion, that whether you build a tiny house and you go through the L&I process, or you purchase a tiny home and it's RV certified and whatnot, that both of those would be allowed to be placed in a manufactured housing community, and then per se potentially put in someone's backyard as a DADU, and so on. And then other information that is very, access to developers out there working in the day-to-day. You're really referring to factory assembled structures, the L&I, the Washington Association as well, building officials. They have, everybody on their website has a lot of information regarding all of this stuff, but really L&I is going to be your main source, right, for how to look at it if someone's building a tiny house locally, or the contractor's calling you to put one in a yard and looking at, how is this unit going to be put in permanently. One thing I did want to bring up is a septic sewer issue. We've been confirming with a lot of folks that we're still going to follow ANSI on the standards for gallon flow usage on them, and that really depends on how it's built as well. So if you're building a tiny house in the state of Washington, all of that's going to come into place too. L&I doesn't really have a specific requirement for this, but we like the concept of the gallon flow usage still being on the RV spectrum, and that would allow for 9 tiny homes to be hooked up to a 3-bedroom septic tank. So it does increase the development aspect of that, the cost aspect for developers to be incentivized to allow for, instead of mobile homes, maybe a tiny home community. So we take a little code from the mobile homes. We take a little code from the RV parks when we do a tiny house community development. If the county is more receptive to that, we kind of show them that we're following more of the health department RV style usage, but more of the mobile home park or a cottage housing per se development concept as well for these units on wheels. And that comes into place of tiny housing, micro housing, and just how it's combined with the factory built concept and recreational vehicle as well. So those are just a few steps, but
yeah.
Do you want to let Micah jump in at this point?
We have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
And I know what we wanted to do was sort of get this basic understanding so that we're all using these same terms sort of moving forward together. So I know we did want to kind of pause here to make sure that we're kind of getting it together. So someone asks, will chief building official or a certified building official certify a tiny house on wheels?
So the city would basically have to refer to L&I, but a city could per se develop like a approved plan or some sorts, working with the Washington State building officials, right, Micah? You could jump in at this point and tell me what you think.
That's a depends type answer.
Yeah.
If L&I wants to do that, for specifically stay for this answer on tiny house on wheels, we could look at that as a building official under the alternate means and methods through the administrative section of the code. However, more than likely that frame and wheels would need to be engineered and shown how it will meet an alternate method for a foundation. Usually those, what we're going to do is we're going to consider those a coach or a trailer, and those would need to be regulated by L&I with the appropriate label, and most of that would stay with them. And then the placement would come down to the land use requirements and not a residential code issue.
Great, yeah, thanks. So Todd, just to make sure that we're having like that level playing field, if you had to, in like as few words as possible, explain the difference between a tiny home and a tiny house, what's the difference?
The difference is the Homestead Act ruling and the placement, really. You are, when you're building a tiny house, L&I is very, very strict about this. Michael Luke is a buddy of mine, and we were talking about this. He's like, I'm so glad you're the Tiny House Association, not the Tiny Home Association, because a house is a legally built structure, permitted, IRC, there's no question about whether that thing was built up to code, because LNI is going to make sure of that, right? Whether it's in the state or not. So if you have a unit that, which brings into the equation of a tiny home. So I've owned Seattle tiny homes in the state of Washington. We are an LNI factory assembled structures division factory for them. And we're self-certifying. So I'm able to actually certify my own units to the park model standard or the RV standard. I can't go build to the tiny house standard because they don't have a factory process built for that yet. It's just too new. They are going to come out with it, and we're going to definitely get on that playing field. And I'm also working to get on the modular playing field right now. But that being said, we engineer everything to meet the IRC standards. We are working to meet 119.5, but build better. And we have plans that can prove that. So per se, someone buys an RV from us, they can actually take our plan sets, show them to your county building official and say, these meet code now. So that comes in the equation. If they want to be there permanently, tiny house, that kind of language comes into play. I want to be permanent in the backyard. I want to get tax assessed value. I want to get a real mortgage for my house. That's a house. A home category is more, well, you might be able to get, some cuddle financing like a mobile home, but you're going to get more of an RV style loan, and you're going to be less temporary, but still provides a pathway to home ownership for folks. That's important, I must say. And it's usually a cheaper route to go, right? Than going the whole impact fee, permit fee way. But it allow people to be in that tiny house community for a year, put it in their grandma's backyard for a year, and then move to Arizona. And I think that is crucial to this story. And I have a couple of stories later I was going to share on some situations that have happened, and nonprofits getting involved, and their excitement around this is really crucial to that component of being flexible. Right now, we feel like most cities have kind of miscommunicated it. They see the manufactured language in the bill, and they just go, that's for manufactured housing parks. That's not for us. But this did create pathways for those units to be placed on to their own pieces of land, and most organizations and planners are going to see that as, okay, I need to permit this unit as a full-time dwelling unit, and that's fine. But when we're talking about, I wanted to specifically point out those home languages, the Homestead Act ruling and all of that, because it is crucial to be able to have a temporary language in there that would allow for 365 days as well.
So Steve is asking, are you only referring to tiny homes built on a trailer frame or placed on a permanent foundation?
And so technically Appendix Q established the trailer foundation as a permanent foundation. It's portable, which means that unit can be moved from site to site to site, and it's still considered permanent. That doesn't mean that a city or ordinance can say we want to have some hurricane tie downs and strapping done. That metal foundation is considered a permanent foundation now in the state of Washington. Just the same thing as if you're building a site-built unit on a piece of property on a cement foundation.
Great, appreciate that.
Micah's raising his hand.
Micah's hand is like hot. So I do want to say I'm hot in the chat there. Preston, I will circle back up, but I do want to let Micah step in here because I can see Micah going like, this is exactly why I'm here, everyone. I'm so excited. So Micah, jump on in. Please do keep posting in the chat. But just so you know, I'm not missing anyone's question, but we'll let Micah jump in here.
No, you're fine. I actually wanted to ask Todd a question, and just, can you share a little bit more on Appendix Q and the amendments that Washington adopted? I know I'm going to try to cover that, but I would like to hear your point of view on that and kind of how you're interpreting the current iteration of Appendix Q for Washington State. Maybe other folks like to hear that too, but that would, and I'm on the panel, but I still have questions. So.
Yeah, no, I get it. I went to the meeting with you originally when we were talking about this, and there was a lot of language in there about, the more of the stick built on-site, construction for tiny house communities and whatnot. And then when it came to trailer chassis, I'm like, well, we're losing 2 feet when we're doing a trailer, right? And how are we, making sure that that loft height is getting livable? So loft height does not get calculated into floor space, as many people are aware. But when it comes down to the trailer foundation itself, as far as L&I is concerned, they have literally said, we don't care about the trailer, which is kind of scares me. Because we buy from TrailerMade, my shirt here down in Colorado, and they overbuild their trailers. We don't want our trailers falling apart. We want to make sure they're engineered safe, 24 on center, cross member beams and 7,000 pound axles and all of that, because you're putting a lot of weight around the edge too. We have folks calling me all the time saying, I have an RV trailer, I want to donate it, to you. Can you just build a tiny home on it? And the answer is no, I won't attempt that because it's not built for the weight. So as far as what we envision for adapting Appendix Q was that a trailer chassis could be used and it's considered permanent. Whether or not who's looking at that, L&I is like, we really can't look at the trailer foundation because that's DOT. And nobody's talking about that right now. So I think coming down the line, we should have a bill that establishes some foundational language around trailer chassis foundations specifically. And Micah, maybe you have some ideas about how to get the building officials into that. But right now it's kind of open gray area. It is definitely open, and we make recommendations every day. Don't build them on an RV trailer foundation. That's not good. But that being said, loft heights and different things come to play, and then the energy requirements for the state of Washington, which are a lot of fun to navigate. Building to all those is crucial to meet the IRC code and the full-time dwelling code. And even as an RV builder myself, I want to try to achieve those. When we do stair treads and risers, we try to achieve those. But is there more of a direction about the trailer, Micah, that you wanted to hear about on that? Or is that kind of just the synopsis of it's kind of a gray area at the moment?
No, I think you answered what I was looking for. It's technically not in there yet, but that's something we're going to strive for, especially your organization would like to see, is to try to get a trailer or some type of metal frame, sans the axles at this point, to count as some type of foundation structure, which I definitely think can be done in the residential code. But again, right now it would be an alternative method, and I would have to go through an administrative process, but it can be done. But I definitely think it's something we can see. So you answered my question. Thank you. I'll let you go back to your PowerPoint.
No problem. Yeah. And when we build the park model code style, L&I wants to see everything. So we do send them to trailer engineering with that one. And that really if a city or a county per se really wants a black and white, making sure things are built to the 119.5 is a great process.
So we actually have a few questions that are specifically around foundations. So I'm going to read I'm going to read 3 questions because they're all around this topic of foundations, and it might just expedite answering to kind of like hear all of them at the same time. So one is, what about an L&I approved tiny house that's placed on a lot on a permanent foundation and then does title elimination to convert to from a mobile structure to a taxable improvement? So it's going to be one. And then the next one is, with a tiny home on wheels, could a city require that the wheels are removed and that it's anchored similar to what's done with a manufactured home on a residential lot? And then closer, where do you just find this trailer foundation criteria in the code? Like, is there a section of Appendix Q where someone could go to look at it? No, right? Okay. So those are 3 questions just about foundations. And Micah, if you want to jump in there too, because I already know you and I have talked a lot about these topics. So so if anybody So again, the first one is about like, can someone go through kind of like title elimination the same way they would have done for a mobile and get on to a permanent foundation? And then could a city include in their requirements that if you're on wheels, you have to remove them and get onto a foundation?
I think that first question, Todd would probably know the more legal ins and outs of that answer than I would. I can give you the technical code, which I think the other two questions will kind of cover. But on that question, Todd, you probably have way more knowledge than I would in that realm.
I was going to throw you under the bus on that one. I mean, I know of 6 units right now on wheels that have been permitted within West Seattle alone, and those happened like 6 years ago. So, you know, Seattle has those alternative methods of construction, blah, blah, blah. That's a pretty progressive, and then, you know, depending on how hard you push, you can get things through. So yeah, the answer is definitely title elimination, you know, attaching it to property. That is what tiny house is, that opportunity there to do that. And to put it on a parcel of land, you know, somewhere rurally and tie it in just like you would take a mobile home or a park model per se. Pierce County has a code where you can eliminate title and VIN, strip the VIN and attach that as real property. The second question was that they were looking to put
Can a
to tie it down.
jurisdiction, yeah, can a jurisdiction require that? So like, let's say you want to remove some barriers to tiny homes and you think like, okay, well, the way that I can maybe capture some of this is
Yeah.
saying like, as a requirement, you need to get onto a foundation.
Definitely, you know, as a former firefighter, anything revolving around safety is great. As long as we can try to keep it more affordable for folks, that's what the association is going to advocate for. But strapping it down, you know, pouring some cylinder blocks and attaching some straps and telling people to skirt the unit, that's fine. That's not, you know, very expensive to do. Obviously, the utilities has to be figured out. If you're on sewer, you know, you're talking about a little bit of a overcoming that barrier, and hopefully cities will look at House Bill 2001 and incentivize people to put you know, a unit in the backyard that where the water bill is being charged to sewer, right? So really, if someone can tap into a clean out and stuff like that, you know, with a contractor doing it legally and getting permits for that, that's going to be crucial. But keep in mind too, talking about the potty issue, you know, their incinerator toilets are putting more of those in now than any other kind of toilet. You know, there's ways to eliminate that. I know compost is legal in King County. It's gross, but it is legal there. They have a pathway for that. So, you know, there's many opportunities to keep it affordable.
Thanks. Micah, anything more that you wanted to weigh in on just specifically around foundations or requiring them, not requiring them?
Well, I would say if they're trying to get something permanent and approved by the building department itself and not necessarily land use, that yes, it would have to be on a foundation. The current residential code does not recognize steel foundations. They recognize, surprisingly enough, they do have wood foundations in the residential code. So there's I know there's a lot of people that go, you can actually, that's considered a permanent foundation, but it does have design allowances for wood foundations. There's concrete, masonry, and then concrete, precast concrete, and the masonry, like Todd had mentioned, where, you know, that's kind of a standard tie down application now. You're stacking concrete blocks or masonry blocks and strapping it down, but those are recognized. And so maybe that's the path. And I think there was a mention in the chat of trying to get some type of design criteria for steel, you know, like the steel frame to be considered a foundation, or maybe it has to be attached to something else in a special way. But that's really the foundation materials that are currently recognized in the residential code. So if you are going to come in, like Todd mentioned, with a unit and you want to require them to take the wheels off, they would still have to provide an alternative method design to the code to allow that steel frame to be classified as a foundation. So that's it for me on foundations. I think I'll cover a little more in my short presentation.
Yeah, sounds great. Okay. So I'm not seeing too many. Oh, look, as soon as I say, yeah, so we are going to share a lot of the links. I am cutting and pasting, so I've had a few questions. So I know Micah has links to the code in his presentation, and Todd is going to send over his, and we can live link out to all of the bills that are in Micah's presentation. We will also, I'm taking notes out of the chat, so things that people are sharing in the chat, we will be able to share some links on. I'm sort of like doing a little cutting and pasting here into a Word document. So we'll try to get all of those materials out to everyone, so you don't have to be frantically taking notes. There is a question that relates specifically to a few areas of the building code. And because I know Micah is going to talk a little bit more about that, the name as it's posting is like P. Fegley. So I'm not ignoring your question, but I know that Micah is going to talk a little bit more about some code sections, so I don't want to jump too far ahead here. So, oh, it looks like maybe one more question, and then I think we'll move into a short break. And then when we come back, Todd's going to tell us a little bit about like a person who wants to live in a tiny house or a tiny home, like what are they even doing? And then we'll shift to hearing from Micah. So the next question here is, if these tiny houses were designed to IBC and have a permanent foundation, is that just a small modular building?
If you're looking for me, that'll be a yes and a no question. If it's built off-site, like factory built, I want to say that would be modular construction. But if it's built again and designed to have a permanent foundation that's built on site, then it would just be a dwelling unit. So that's a kind of a yes and no.
Yeah, I mean, L&I is going to give a stamp on that unit, and that's the easiest way to look at it. If it's been certified by them, that means electrical, the plumbing, everything is to code for IBC, building codes, IRC codes. But yeah, that it should be a no-brainer when the city or county is looking at this. That okay, we have a unit that is just like a mobile home, just like a modular home. It's been factory built somewhere else. States covered it as far as liability. Let's say it's come from out of state. If it's meant for permanent habitation within the state, that inspector is going to have to fly to Canada or fly wherever to go and inspect that unit. So we know the state of Washington's taken that liability there. And then it just comes down to placement. And I think that's pretty simple to look at itself.
Great. Okay. Well, yeah, the questions that are starting to roll in now lead perfectly to what we wanted to cover after the break. So let's have a 10-minute self-care break, and we'll come back together at 1 o'clock, and we'll figure out how we're going to remove all these barriers to tiny homes by hearing about and tiny houses once we return. So 10-minute break, everyone, and we'll see you right back here at 1 o'clock. I love that the questions are still hopping even during the break. This is great.
I'm watching that. I'm like reading them all.
Yep. Oh, there's one specific for you, Todd. Did you see it there from Sharon?
New stuff. Let's see.
She asks, in your work with L&I, are they planning to change the definition for recreational vehicle to allow for longer use as a living unit? Because camping is different than permanent housing.
There really is no pathway for that. Even RVIA fought against our bills, and for good reason. That is, if RVs get considered permanent housing or labeled that as such, they would have to change a lot of their products that they're putting into them to make sure that they meet more of an international residential code standard. Everybody from HUD gets involved. It becomes a whole huge nightmare, and honestly would make it impossible for people to buy RVs. So
Right.
As far as we're concerned at the state level, the Homestead Act ruling in Seattle removed any limitation for that and opened up a perfect avenue for someone to buy a tiny home on wheels RV certified unit and live in that yearly, more considering themselves on a short-term basis.
Great, yeah, thanks.
But unfortunately, L&I has nothing to do with placement or they only can do the making sure stuff is built to ANSI codes or IRC codes or whatnot. Thanks, Jane. I'm going to put in a link for just, actually Janet is on this call too, but just the Appendix Q tiny home on foundations, Appendix Q stuff. Anybody wants to check that out?
Sure.
Good information.
Yeah. All right, so by my clock, we have about 2 more minutes. Yeah. We have about 2 more minutes before we come back from break. If you're just stepping back up to your computer, we've been enjoying the chat for Q&A. So you didn't miss anything. We're just reading questions in the chat there.
Todd, when I came back, were you talking about the kind of the document handouts from L&I on tiny houses, tiny home stuff?
Well, someone asked a question if L&I could change the terminology for RVs so that people could live in them longer term. And I just explained that HUD and RVIA and everybody else would freak out, and RVs would be 3 times more costly suddenly, and it wouldn't be a good thing. But the Homestead Act ruling is one that I try to educate most cities on. And right now, most kind of code enforcement tell me they have a bark, but they can't bite on that situation anyway. But it's coming.
Excellent.
Yeah. Well, we're just back at that 1 o'clock, and I know I'm excited to hear more from both of you. If we can, I'll just welcome everybody back and just start us right off. Todd, with you. Oh, Sharon's got her hand raised. Sharon, we'll take your really quick question, but I think we're gonna jump into our presentation, but go for it if you want to come off mute.
Hi, Sharon. You're unmuted, but we can't hear you.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, so kind of, and I've asked this question at Wobble before, when L&I factory was there, is that for me, when we're looking at that label, when it says RV and they want to use it as a ADU or something like that, right? Is that by their definition is for recreational camping, not for, you know, long-term occupancy? And that's kind of, I asked Todd if maybe they had approached L&I to change that, because I don't want to violate state law on what their definition is either, right? So
I wouldn't, sorry to interrupt, but I wouldn't even do that. I would, if the unit was built, you know, with 16 on center framing and different points like that, try to get the plans from them, because you can strip, like, you know, before we talk about stripping the VIN, you could eliminate title on that, so that unit no longer becomes an RV. But you at the city level or the county level would have to make sure that you know the unit's built to a certain standard, right? That's habitable. So that, I think that could be done and looked at that way.
because I mean, when a mobile home comes into my city, I look at that label, right?
Yeah,
Or
yeah,
manufactured or whatever you want to call it today. So, and I asked Factory Built about this and they're like, well, you can do what you want to. It's state law. You're giving me the definition, right?
Yeah.
So all I need is for somebody to get sick or die or happen, and I'm getting sued because I didn't follow state law, right? There's no immunity for me, right?
Well, that comes down to, you know, to me, if the person wants to be there permanent, you know, and wants to be a DADU, you know, can the city or county convince them to just be more temporary, and lean on the, you know, the rights that they have for that, or the Homestead Act ruling, or do they want, if they want to be permanent and want to be placed there full time, then it comes down to, well, the city knows that unit was built to code, right? That the wiring's been certified, that, you know, it's been inspected as that RV, but can you provide me plans that prove that unit has, you know, the right insulation and was built to a certain, you know, standard for habitable. And that comes down to, like Michael was talking about earlier, the alternative methods and means stuff. I think you could dematerialize it down to a point where that unit can be permitted and placed. But you really can lean on Senate Bill 5383 as far as eliminating the liability of the county and city, because it talks all over the place in that. If you go and actually look at the bill itself, it talks about recreational vehicle tiny homes in the bill. And that covers you as far as taking it in context. If you read through the whole thing, it talks about placement of that, and you could look to allow that for in so many ways. You know, I know that every code official, you know, doesn't want the liability, right? And so if you try to eliminate that with that bill, I think it could be done.
Great.
Yeah.
All
and
right.
then we're talking about Anna, right? Or who wants
Yeah,
to build,
poor
buy
Anna.
a
She
tiny.
just wants a tiny home for Pete's sake.
Yeah, she wants to live legally and something she can afford. You know, $50,000, $80,000 is kind of the average of a tiny home nowadays, a tiny house. And you know, it really comes down to a couple avenues. Do you want to buy or you want to build one? You know, Anna's going to have to, you know, figure that out. But it comes in a lot of questions, including placement. Usually if someone wants to have everything figured out from the moment they start, whether it's financing or placement. But we're going to give her two choices right now when she calls me on the phone. You know, are you going to buy it or are you going to build it? And you can build it yourself, do it yourself build, or you can hire a contractor in the state of Washington who's going to go through L&I and build that unit for you. The other way of going is you're going to buy a unit online through a builder. My company is Seattle Tiny Homes, or you're going to use Tumbleweed, or, you know, Incredible Tiny Homes back in Tennessee. And they're either going to build it to a certified standard, which most of them are going to be RV certified, RVIA, which is a third party certification. Washington doesn't recognize it for building, but they do, you know, allow RVs that are RDIA certified to be placed in the parks. So you can do the DADU or park model as well. Certification, a DADU concept would be if that builder back in Tennessee is going to call LNI and, you know, basically send the plans, and LNI is going to approve and send an inspector out, and you're going to have to pay for that. It's going to be a little bit of money. So those are kind of a couple avenues that Anna's going to have to decide which she's going to want to tackle. And then comes down to the homes being built, done, transportation, whether it's out of state or in the state to the site. Then comes down to basically, you know, whether you own the property or whether someone else owns the property. If it's going to be placed in a tiny house community, if it's going to be in a manufactured housing community, if it's going to be backyard in your unit for, you know, a year, 6 months, 3 months, and then move somewhere else, you're going to have to figure all that out with your local jurisdiction and make sure that you're not breaking any codes. And then the DADU permitting concept as well, like we were just talking about, that tiny house can be used as a DADU down the road a bit. That's why we're here. We're working on this to get it in there and let everybody know that this can be done. But it's a house, and you're following the LNI code. You're doing all of that. You know, it could be done. And then, you know, there's a lot of questions about renting to own. You know, can Anna, if she can't afford to build it outright or buy it outright, you know, what are her options? Her best options are going to be in the tiny house communities through organizations like 21st Mortgage, which do mobile home loans. They finance Seattle tiny homes as well, builds, stuff like that. And it's coming down the pike where you could buy that unit and get a 25, 30-year mortgage for that and place it in a tiny home community. You could also put it on your own lot if you own that property. Again, local jurisdiction is going to have to work with you on looking at that like it's a mobile home, basically, like a manufactured house. And so that's kind of what comes for those folks who are looking to buy a tiny home or place a tiny home is, you know, you're looking at the state now on inspecting your unit. You're looking at either buying a pre-certified unit, or you're also going down to your local county and city level and working with them on the placement issue of that unit. It's very complex. I tried to simplify it here, but you have state and now your local jurisdiction you're gonna have to work with on placing that unit. And yeah, that kind of is what Anna's gonna have to do, or anybody else. Is there any questions at this point?
Well, poor Anna, it does sound a little complex, but maybe Micah is going to demystify the code a little bit for us so that we're better able to help Anna when she comes to the counter and runs into one of us, right? So we'll pass on the speaking torch to Micah. And I know Todd's going to come back towards the end here to talk a little bit more. But we'll also have joint Q&A with Todd and Micah again towards the end. So Micah, help us, Micah. We need to understand the code.
All right, I'm going to share my screen. We'll probably flip back and forth and share different screens and make everybody seasick, but there is a purpose behind it. So first, I want to say thanks to Mary for the great introduction, and for Todd and all you being here and sharing your knowledge and everything that you do in this industry for these spaces. I know we don't always see eye to eye on some of this, but you obviously are coming from it from a different perspective and trying to get these in where I have to come at it from a code issue and how does the code apply? When I say code, that would be the residential code. And so it's just different. And there's so many different terms that causes a lot of confusions. I think I mentioned that in here, but we're going to kind of get into it, and you will hear some stuff Todd already covered. I might double up, but I'm going to try to pass over that stuff a little more when I do double up, and then we'll just kind of go from there. So is that going to function? There we go. So as Todd mentioned, labor and industries is really your place to start. The two links that I provided here, they go to documents that give a really good, simple breakdown of what is or is not a tiny home, tiny house, what L&I regulates. I did put that link in the chat that I think Mary shared with you. And these documents are on, there's a ton of good information there when you have questions of who's going to regulate the construction of this, not necessarily the placement of it, because it'll say in there that's land use, the jurisdiction's requirement. But really, this is going to get into who's doing the technical review of these units. Is it going to be your building department, your building official, or is it going to be L&I? These packets really give you a lot of good information. And when I say if it's not with L&I, it's going to fall under the residential building code. Even if it's within L&I, they're going to review it to the code, but it's going to be on wheels. Now, if you're coming in with a small space and it's not on wheels, it's going to fall under the residential code, which is that RCW 1927-31. So part of those documents that I linked to, one of them is just some excerpts here. And again, I mentioned previously, a lot of different terminology for what these units are. I want to point out in the building code or the residential code, what you may not realize is tiny homes are really not new. The minimum habitable space requirement in the current Washington State residential code is 70 square feet. That's it. Now, restrooms, other spaces like that are not considered habitable square feet. So that 70 square feet is usually a 7-foot by 10-foot space. We have approved spaces or complete dwelling units, and you see the definition here on the screen. We've approved dwelling units that are 125 square feet, and they meet all the minimum requirements of the code. They're not a tiny home. They're just a dwelling unit. So that's how we as code officials had to approach changes in the code when the legislation came in that says, hey, do something about tiny homes. Well, tiny homes to us are not anything special. They already exist in the code. However, there are some spaces in tiny homes that are special, like lofts. I know a lot of you, when you look at the original language of Appendix Q, and I could share that on the screen if folks need me to, when I do that, it brings up the right screen. I'm not gonna pick the right screen. I'm gonna totally make everybody sick. Let's go with that one. Let's not go with that one. Let's put this up differently. Maybe nothing. Let's stop sharing and try that again. What I want to share in the original language of Appendix Q is that the majority of Appendix Q is sleeping loft, at least on the original code language. Now I got the right one. All right, you should be seeing a building code come up here. Hopefully that worked. And if it didn't, I apologize.
Yep, we've got it.
Okay, so I'm going to actually go into the 2021 IRC language, which is the national level without code changes. And this is what you see. You're going to have some definitions, ceiling height information, and then you're going to get into the bulk of Appendix Q's lofts. So again, we already allow small spaces. However, loft spaces in a current residential code would have to meet full habitable space requirements, which means that 7-foot dimension and usually a 7-foot or 7'6" ceiling height. Well, that sucks when you're trying to put in a loft. It's too big, it's too high. And so now we have to differentiate between what is a mezzanine, which would meet that full habitable space requirement, and what is, what we consider this special loft or special mezzanine, which is a loft or sleeping loft. The current code, the 2018 code, has it as a sleeping loft. We do have a code change in for 2021 codes that's going to take this and make it. In other words, because we had a lot of the feedback going, well, can it only be used for sleeping? What if I want to, use that as my office space? Everybody's got at home office space now. Hey, I want to put this loft space in and go up there and sit down and work on my computer. Great. Let's call it a loft. However, let's add some additional safety features like egress, although it's a modified egress based out of Appendix Q. So it's the ladders, the permanent ladders, the stairs that they've got a higher rise and run, stuff like that. And let's allow those in any dwelling unit. Why not? Dwelling unit to dwelling unit. We should allow these in small spaces. If somebody wants to build a 5,000 square foot house and put some lofts in them, great, let's do that. We are, however, in the new code change proposal, providing some limitations. We did get feedback from the National Association of Home Builders that said, hey, we don't want you to regulate plant shelves. Okay, we get that. So if it's 35 square feet and you're not providing a permanent means of egress, we're not going to call it a loft. That's your plant shelf. So not regulated. So we're trying to find that balance between what is over regulation and acceptable regulation, and then providing some flexibility for people like Todd's folks that want to go, hey, we want to have this loft with a 3-foot ceiling height, and without it having to meet all the minimum habitable space dimensions. So that's what the original 2000 or the original Appendix Q does for that language. It just brings in a bunch of loft. So what we did in 2018 Washington State Code is we took most of that language, moved it into section R327, as you see here. And if you go through that, it pretty much takes a lot of language verbatim. However, when we did propose this at the national code level, we got a lot of feedback. Hey, this is kind of in conflict with this section or that section. And we just got a more broad view of stakeholders involved, and they said, let's make this better. So that's what the code change proposal is at the state level. I do want to let you know that we did just get at the committee action hearing for the 2024 IRC, we did get this sleeping loft or this loft proposal in the national code for residential. And last year we got it approved as an appendix to the IBC. So that's going to be a whole new thing in the building code. So we're moving along with some of these things. All right, I'm going to stop share. I'm going to turn that off. Let me know if that comes to the PowerPoint without the building code.
Yes, we're back on your
Okay.
PowerPoint.
Perfect.
Thank you.
So
for that,
you'll hear a
Micah.
lot
Thank
to
you
talk.
for going. Thank you for
Go
going federal with that stuff. That's amazing.
We're getting there. So as Todd mentioned earlier, you're going to see this dwelling unit definition a lot. It may be different than a lot of land use definitions, but it has 4 specific criteria I want to bring up. And that's it needs to have permanent provisions for living, sleeping, eating, cooking, and sanitation. I combine a little bit of those. But if you don't have one of those components, it's technically not a dwelling unit by definition. So I know a lot of this comes into question when, oh, I want to convert my garage to some living space. Well, that's great. If you don't provide cooking and sanitation, say that's your detached garage, we're not going to consider that a dwelling unit per the building code. It's just an accessory space that you're going to go out and, watch TV in. Okay, great. So remember that definition. I'm going to bring it up several times. Again, what we talked about, what we tried to do was bring in changes to the residential code. And that's what this slide talks about, is that moving stuff from Appendix Q into the residential code. That we get into these, again, the definition. And then when we talk about habitable space, I'm not going to switch over to the code again at this point, but it's under section R304. And that talks about that 7-foot dimension and that 70 square foot of space as your minimum habitable space requirement. Now, it was brought up, I think, by Todd and in the comments asking about the RCW to allow smaller. They did pass legislation that allows jurisdictions to amend the residential code. I guess, let me take a step back. Currently, jurisdictions are not allowed by law to modify the residential building code or the residential energy code. Individual jurisdictions cannot do that unless they get their amendments approved through council, which is a laborious process, and a lot of folks don't do it. So there, you might come across and see, hey, we've amended our residential building code. It's probably done illegal. There's a lot of that happening. However, In this instance, there are a couple of areas where the state has said, hey, we want the jurisdictions to be able to modify this in the residential code if they so choose. One of those is going to be the minimum habitable space. So if a jurisdiction wants to pass a regulation that says you can have 20 square feet as your minimum habitable space, okay, they can. I think they're going to have a hard time justifying livability of that type of space. I think, when you talk about a 7 foot by 10 foot space, that's smaller than most bedrooms in most everyone's house at this point. It's a really tiny space. So when I talked about the ones where we approved 125 square foot unit, that had a full bathroom in it, kitchen, had the sanitation, the sleeping, the eating, all those spaces on 125 square feet. That's tiny. That's a really small space to consider. So far, I don't think there's been a lot of jurisdictions that have taken that opportunity to amend that space smaller than 70 square feet. Even though the RCW allows that. The RCW, there's also an RCW where I talked about cities can do something that's usually on sprinkler systems. Residential, single, 1 and 2 family are not required to have sprinklers. However, the state says if a jurisdiction wants to require those, they don't have to go through the state to get that approval. Then we move into section 305, and that gets into more of the ceiling height. Again, that's the habitable space requirement. You're going to have a minimum room space and a minimum ceiling height. So how do we get around some of that to provide these smaller spaces? That's where that loft amendment to section 327 came in. That's going to allow those lower ceiling heights, smaller spaces to be utilized, similar to how the Appendix Q already was allowing them to do. Again, tiny house is not really something new in the building code. It's just a dwelling unit. Tiny house on wheels still is not going to be in the building code. It will be regulated by L&I, and they will have the construction done per the residential code, but it's not going to be within the residential code for the frame. Any questions before I keep moving on? Because I'm going to run through a whole lot of information, then we can have a bunch of questions at the end too.
We had one question that was just asking, is a local jurisdiction allowed to amend an appendix, or does the amendment of an appendix also have to get reviewed?
Good question. They are, if the appendix is adopted by the state, it's not required to be adopted by the jurisdiction. If they choose to adopt the appendix, then they can adopt it as written by the state. If they want to modify that appendix, it has to go through the same process. Any modification to what the state has adopted for 1 and 2 family dwelling code or residential dwelling code has to go through the state for an amendment, aside from the growth area and the fire sprinklers.
Right. Okay, great. Thank you.
So again, we get into, the Appendix Q, and I kind of showed that on the screen previously. It still left the tiny house definition in Appendix Q, but it took the other definitions, the loft and other items, and moved those into the main body of the code. And for those that don't deal in the building code that much, an appendix is just kind of, hey, it's an idea. Some jurisdictions want to use it. It's a simple way to go adopt something without them having to rewrite it, but we don't feel it's viable enough or used enough to put in the main body of the code. So when you get something in the main body of the code, it's actually a pretty big deal. There's a lot of national thoughts that the code is mature. What I mean by that is there doesn't need to be a lot of changes. We do get a significant amount of small changes shifted, but when you get a big change like taking sleeping lofts and putting them in the main body of the code, that's a huge deal, because you get different groups on board, which would be groups like the National Association of Home Builders, state fire marshals, or national fire marshal or firefighter associations, because they have a lot of issue with small spaces and not being able to get out of them, and smoke inundation and all these other things. So to get something like this in the main body of the code is a really big deal. So hopefully that will benefit Todd and their group. So it's just the sleeping loft R327 is just a modification of these things. Yeah, it's small. It's the 3-foot ceiling height. It's the modified egress, lower room height. All those things that were in Appendix Q are now in the main body of the code. Go use them for those smaller spaces. And you should be able to allow those for any dwelling unit. And that's why we moved it there. Not just ones that are less than 400 square feet, because we can already build less than 400 square feet. And I'm going to kind of run through these. Again, it's With a sleeping loft, it has a minimum height above the floor. We are changing that, I believe, in the next code cycle. So for 2021, that will be different. I do have a link in this PowerPoint to that upcoming code change amendment. It's not fully approved. It still has to go through the final state building code council processes, but it is proposed, and there's some great changes in there. One of the two big items I wanted to point out is this allows for ceiling heights less than 80 inches. That's the minimum habitable ceiling height. So this allows for those spaces to be lower. It has a 5-foot minimum horizontal dimension instead of 7 feet. And then the big one here is going to be the 35 to 69 square feet. So once you hit that 70 square foot size, you're going to be considered a mezzanine and would have to meet the requirements of a mezzanine. However, there is a Washington amendment that's long-standing that allows a 200 square foot storage space without permanent access or egress to be in there and not be classified as a mezzanine. However, you can only use it for storage. Okay, and you're not going to have, it's got to be, you got to take a ladder up and down. One of the things we want to, push on this for the residential code to be classified as a sleeping loft, you have to provide it with a permanent means of egress, whether that's a permanent ladder, permanent set of stairs. That's the only way you're going to trigger this requirement for that space. So there was a lot of debate back and forth based on that current Washington state amendment for those storage lofts of 200 square feet accessed by a ship's ladder. If that ship's ladder is permanent, you're going to be regulated differently. So there's nuances there that I just want you to be aware of. Then again, we have modified stairways, modified ladders. And then when you look at the headroom requirements for stairways, it's going to be a 6'2" headroom instead of, the 6'8" or something else. And then the width is a 20-inch minimum width for your stairways. So I think it's minimum. There's a variable in there, but it's smaller than the minimum 36 required for other habitable space. This kind of gives you some visual of what that means. Hey, you're going to have these small loft spaces. I'm not going to read all this for you. Hopefully you'll get the gist of what we're going for here. And then we do get into the ladder aspect. It does have some specifics on there. It does give, a weight capacity and things like that. And it gives you a specific degree of incline. But again, these are things we pulled from Appendix Q and put in the main body of the code for everyone. And then it talks about guards. You're going to have you're still going to want guards or will be required to have guards. This is going to be changed a little bit in the 2021. I know some of the modifications we've done to this kind of align more with how guards are in the rest of the residential code, because that's a whole specific industry. And we got a lot of pushback with modifying this to allow that half height between the space, the floor and the ceiling of that loft space. So that'll modify a little bit. And then one of the things that's going away, which was a big surprise that we actually got them to agree to that, is the emergency escape and rescue opening. So if you have a bedroom, you're going to have an emergency escape and rescue opening if it's a space you're sleeping. Well, that's really onerous in these small spaces. They talked about, well, it could go through the roof. What if it's, on all interior walls, things like that. So there was a lot of questions on how that would function. So that will actually go away in the next code cycle with a slight modification. The thought is that if you can use these for sleeping, we would like to have the room that it opens up into, that the loft opens into, to have an emergency escape and rescue opening, because you don't necessarily have to put these in a bedroom. Say this is off your living room and you want to use it for sleeping. However, you don't have that emergency escape and rescue opening in a living room as a requirement. If you put a loft in there, we're going to kind of have that extra level of safety. So that's kind of where we're finding a balance with code requirements to allow these and regulate these. This is a great example of what we're talking about for these small spaces or small houses. This is a full dwelling unit. The living room is kind of where you might think you're standing taking the picture, and the sleeping area is up above the bathroom. And that would meet the requirements. And we're trying to find a way to allow those outright in the code, no problem, no special whatevers. Just go meet these standard, consistent code application, code provisions, and you can do this. And this is where you'll find that link to that proposed state modification. I'm not going to go to that because I'm pretty sure we'll have a lot more questions. And I want to get through the last slide, which this is what we kind of talked about. And I said trailers and coaches and stuff like that. These on wheels are not considered a tiny house within the residential code. For Todd, for L&I, for others, they'll call this a tiny house, but if you're trying to put this in the residential code, you're not going to find it right now. And I think that's where Todd was mentioning the opportunities to maybe change some of the code to say, hey, maybe we can find a way to regulate this type of design within the residential code as a prescriptive approach and make it a little easier. Hopefully we can do that, but maybe I think you're going to get a lot of pushback from the code officials on something that falls under DOT or L&I and that whole who's going to do all the work. So that's the end of my presentation. However, I do want to share the current Washington amendment, and we'll talk about that for a minute. So let me stop sharing my screen there and go back. Actually, I think I can just bring it up. How's that? See if that works. Nope, because I completely closed out of it. How about that? I failed. All right. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. And then I want to pull that file up. I apologize. I don't know how I completely closed out of that, but it'll only take me a second to get back there.
I think it's crazy that they're eliminating the window egress out of the sleeping lofts because I imagine it's not going to change for the RV codes that's required. We've had to get very creative, whether it's a skylight that is opening as an egress, so you can include a fire ladder as a company, but I bet that's not going to affect us. We're still going to have to do that.
Yeah, it was an interesting thing. They thought when you're building this into a larger dwelling unit that will be a real problem to design. If you're building it in the smaller spaces, it could easily be done. Or again, they're talking, oh, you come down the ladder, you go out the egress window on a larger space there. So it was kind of one of those compromise things, Todd, I want to say. So, but I'm going to share the current Washington amendment. I can make that bigger. Let me know when that pops up. Nope, I need to hit the actual share button. You select it and then you have to.
Yes, it's showing now.
Okay, great. Thank you. So this is where you can see I talked about we took away items from Appendix Q and moved them in the code. So the strike throughs, they didn't go away. They just got moved into the main body of the code. So the last definition that's in Appendix Q, if a jurisdiction wants to adopt it, is the definition of what this appendix could or would be allowed to apply to. This also allows those lower ceiling heights in here in the appendices. And then there were some modifications at the state level. We did a strike through of all this information. It didn't go away. Again, it just moved into the main body of the code with some modifications. But then we did have some new written regulations that Todd mentioned, and that's, or might have been mentioned in the chat about energy code and air leakage testing. These are the only modifications to the energy code that can be used for tiny houses if this appendix is adopted. If not, you're going to have to meet the requirements of the Washington State Residential Energy Code for that space. So I think that was a question on the envelope and some other stuff. That's where you're going to go find the regulations for those spaces under all the energy compliances within the Residential Energy Code. If your jurisdiction adopts this appendix, then you can use these specific items as an alternate to those requirements of the Washington State Residential Energy Code. And that's it. The rest of it, again, this got moved. However, it's going to go away as well, the EEROs, and we're going to go from there. But that's what I wanted to share today. There is, as you see, a code path for these. We regulate these small spaces. There was an existing code path for a lot of them, aside from the ones on wheels. And that's where Todd and his organization comes in and trying to get legislation changed. And really, the land use side of it needs to look at some modifications. I know that we've changed some things in the building code, especially when it comes to accessory dwelling units. I know Mary and I had a real good conversation on that. We may try to get out ahead of that, but when you look at what an accessory structure is in the building code, it's an incidental use to the primary use. And a second dwelling unit is technically not an incidental use to a primary dwelling unit. It's just a secondary dwelling unit. And it's going to be regulated in the code as a dwelling unit. Dwelling unit's a dwelling unit for the building code. And I just want to reiterate, that's why the building code is different. It's not land use. One thing we did amend out last cycle as well for accessory dwelling unit is mentioned one time in the Washington State Code. It was originally under the definition of dwelling unit. However, we're trying to modify definitions to not have requirements within a definition. You're defining something, your requirement should be in the code. So it was an exception that talked about two-family dwellings. So when you put an accessory dwelling unit within an existing dwelling unit, you didn't have to provide the separation and other items that you would on a two-family dwelling space that you're constructing new. One of the things we did eliminate, and I want to talk about this for land uses, I know there's a lot of jurisdictions that require for say a accessory dwelling, a tiny home or something else, that they have an owner occupied requirement. There is a significant level of legal precedent being set that is against the law. And they are starting to push back on that because it violates those property owner rights. And then who regulates what when you're there as an owner? Doesn't mean you can't own it, but they're telling you, that's kind of that freedom of movement part of the Constitution, where you should be able to live where you want to live and not based on some other, specialty item you'd like to have. So there's some legal precedence there. So that's why we actually removed that owner occupied requirement for accessory dwelling unit from the building code. Not all land use is going to get there. That may be something that you see some state legislation coming down on, and maybe Todd can speak to that, of where they won't allow that as a requirement to allow these additional spaces. I know some jurisdictions still are real heavy into that. It's like, oh, the owner's got to live on there so they can watch it. Well, they're moving away from that for legal precedent. Anyway.
And Michael, can you confirm, is that removed as a requirement for both attached and detached, or is it only removed as a requirement for attached?
That was removed as any requirement in the building code for an accessory dwelling unit, whether that's detached or attached.
Okay, great.
I
sorry.
don't want to get an accessory dwelling unit discussion,
Nope.
but I do want to share that there is still some issues with how they're regulated in the residential code, because technically, if you have a duplex and you put a accessory dwelling unit within each one of those, you are now a fourplex, which should be or would be regulated under the building code. Whole different set of requirements there. So there's some definite interpretation issues and things we're working on there, but doesn't really relate to tiny house. So we'll move back to that.
Yeah. And I know I was sharing with Micah yesterday that the Department of Commerce is trying to come out with some new recommendations on accessory dwelling units and a new model ordinance. So we'll look forward to that sort of coming down the road there. Preston did notice that some of the documents you were sharing on the bottom corner say Seattle Building Code amendments. So he's asking, were you showing things just specific to Seattle, or were you showing things that kind of represented state amendments?
Good question, and I should have pointed that out. I was actually sharing the Seattle residential code. However, we don't modify it. So if you saw the amendments on there, and I can share my screen again real fast, where they have a W here, I will show you that real quick. I think this is what you're asking about, and you can verify if it is not. So down here, you see it says Seattle residential code in the lower right corner. However, if you look up here in the body of the code, it has a W next to the code sections. That's a Washington State amendment. We don't amend anything in the residential code except for the administrative code. However, we still publish our own set of codes. I'm not sure if you're aware that the state, except for 2018, although I'm not a fan of the job they did, they don't print a Washington State code. They provide insert pages, and then they provide the language in the WAC, and that's it. However, for my jurisdiction, I put these codes together, so we include our amendments and Washington State amendments, and we make it an actual full code, digital code and printed version for sale. So thank you for the question. I should have verified that. These are not Seattle modifications. They are Washington modifications. Residential code is just labeled as Seattle. Seattle code for my purposes.
If you don't
Thanks.
have all of those Washington state inserts, what do the interns do after the building code comes out? Isn't it an intern job to flick through and put all the Washington amendments where they go?
You would
just-
think it would be. I have not used a paper version in like 5 years. So
bless.
it's all digital. And the nice thing is we contract directly with ICC. So that's why my code is single column, where if you look at the current Washington code or the ICC code that I shared earlier, it's double column and it's just a nightmare when trying to scroll down the screen. Anyway.
Right.
Yep. Good question. Thank you.
Yeah, I remembered we had talked about that yesterday, that you were going to make sure it wasn't Seattle specific, but I forgot to mention it as well. There was a question that I thought maybe both of you would want to answer, because I think you'll have different perspectives on this, but you might blow me away. I'm always surprised. With more cities and counties requiring residential sprinklers in single family residential and duplexes, are tiny houses, should tiny houses be required to install sprinklers? This particular jurisdiction requires manufactured homes to be sprinkled when they're placed. So should they be requiring tiny homes, or what's kind of the take on that?
That's from my boy Jason Sullivan with Body Lake. How's it going, Jason? Yeah, Micah, you know the code when it comes to building code. I'll let you take this one, because I personally believe any trailer unit, even a manufactured home, it comes as is.
Yeah, that's gonna unfortunately be up to the local jurisdiction if they do decide to require all residential structures to be provided with sprinklers. I'm pretty sure that a lot of those, if they're not, like if you took a mobile home and placed it on an individual lot and not within a park, that they would require those sprinklers in that instance. At least that's how previous jurisdictions I worked for did when they required sprinklers. If it was in a mobile home park, they did not require it because they looked at it differently. However, if it was if it fell under the residential building code, the 1 and 2 family building code, and was permitted by the jurisdiction, and that jurisdiction required sprinklers, that yes, they would have to put sprinklers in it.
Yeah, okay. And that's sort of, and Todd called it right. Yep, that was Jason, and he's saying, yeah, that's what they're doing now. That's consistent with the kind of their practice now. We also, I think you answered this already, just in case my understanding of energy code is different. There was that question that says, do tiny homes, whether they're on a trailer frame or a foundation, do they need to meet the 2018 energy code? And it was no, right? Or yes. Oh, Todd's going like this. I thought we were saying it was the blow test. I don't know. Someone help me.
I think if you're using it for permanent habitation, yeah, it's got to meet the Washington State Energy Code. I mean, in the conversations I've had with Micah, the first state building council meeting regarding 5383, we were, trying to finagle through how this is possible. It's funny because the, placement of windows in a tiny home, you could have a whole 1,200 square foot house with windows on one whole side of the house, but the tiny home was not allowed to have 4 big windows in it because it took up a large chunk of it. So I know when I'm building, I'm trying to meet the energy code. I'm trying to make sure that someone could permit that unit later on down the road. But Micah, do you think that someone's building a tiny house through LNI that's going to have to meet that?
They probably do, but I hate to say this. I don't think LNI does a lot of energy code review or inspection. So I would say that it probably should be constructed to that, but they're probably not going to that depth of review and inspection. So I'll leave it.
Yeah, I know they do with our 119.5 builds, the park model builds. They want to see that we've hit the R factor, insulation factors, and all of that kind of stuff, the minimums at least. The windows and all of that have to meet that. So, but I thought the tiny house LNI stuff, and that's where we've actually been asking anybody, have you actually gone through the program and actually finished a home yet? We haven't found anybody that has come forward and said that they've actually done that through them. But if we can find someone that has, otherwise I'm just going to have to go and build a weird one off the side and try to do that. But as far as I know, that they do look at the plan sets and make sure that, from what I've told with Michael Luke, it has to meet the
energy.
International Building Code
Okay.
for insulation factors and stuff. So yeah.
Okay. I'm seeing someone asked, and this is actually for jurisdictions on the call, if anybody wants to drop into the chat, but someone said or asked, do any jurisdictions that are on the call today allow tiny houses on skids? And I actually Googled what a skid is immediately following that, because I didn't know. So if your jurisdiction allows tiny houses on skids, everybody wants to know your answer in the chat box. And I see David Kinley, your hand raised. So if you want to come off of mute, you can jump in.
Great. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. My question's a little more involved than being able to type, at least with my typing skill in the chat box. So I thought I'd just see if you could answer a question of mine. Want to frame the question that I'm all for affordable housing. My job with Kitsap County is the chief building official. So we get questions like this quite frequently. So I was very interested in the seminar today. The main question, one of the main questions I have is we have a very strong builders group within our county. And one of the things they ask frequently about affordable housing options and tiny houses is just how can we approach these less than what a typical IRC requirement is going to be. And I look at trailers and I go, I think that's an expensive option because I'm looking for engineering. How does that meet seismic zone D2 or E? How does that meet 110V ultimate for wind loading? And so those are some things that I have questions about, and I'm honestly kind of skeptical about. So if there's any way to answer that, that'd be great, because I know one of the things, if we allow something like that, they're going to be like, okay, if it doesn't have to meet energy code or doesn't have to meet seismic design or wind design, why those and not what we're doing?
Yeah, great. Thank you. And I think there was another question kind of specifically about like snow load, wind events and things earlier in the chat as well.
Yeah, so when I design even one of my RV tiny houses per se, I actually have to get that everything engineered, and to meet, we mandate that it has to meet the minimums for snow loads. It has to meet the minimums for our value. It has to meet the minimums for all of that. The seismic, all of that. I mean, we're talking about developing a stronger trailer than a mobile home, manufactured home, that is meant to go over speed bumps and hit these Seattle roads, which are pretty rough. As far as seismic, I've been told that a trailer, it actually can withstand ×4 of the natural seismic load for earthquake prevention, being that it's on wheels and usually on stabilizers when it's officially placed. So I believe there's seismic calculations that can come in straight from the RV Industry Association as well, that are ANSI and all of that kind of stuff that will have that requirement. That being said, we did tell you earlier, there is not exact science when it comes to trailers or mandates or laws in Washington yet. It's kind of we're trekking down the road here and creating a new style of housing. And I'm working on a project in your county, David, that a gentleman wants to do 38 space tiny house community. We're excited about that and developing that community, but reaching into your code and your thought process. I try not to change anything when I go to a city or county. I tell them, let's look at your mobile home code. We can take the wheels off. We can do strap hurricane tie downs, the whole works. We can strip the VINs even. Mainly, I want you to look more at the fact that they're more efficient on water usage than a mobile home. You know, you're not talking a 2-bedroom mobile home that, you know, achieves that, and you have to have a septic tank that matches that. You could save the developer a lot of cash when you're talking about that specifically. But as far as safety concerns, strapping it down and skirting the unit just like a manufactured housing code, I think that is crucial right there, to not have to go to your county councils and your city councils and try to get them to approve a widespread creative plan. You know, if you could look to what you have currently and meet that, then that you know, even the setback issue, you know, if you have a 20-foot wide manufactured home, you have to have a minimum of 20-30 feet between the space to the next unit. The same science works with tiny house. I would say even double the space to make sure you're creating that nice communities that aren't just crammed together. You know, again, that comes down to your level of what you want to do. But as far as safety is concerned, I tiny home on wheels is by far built better and safer, in my opinion, than some of the units that you have probably permitted locally in the manufactured housing community.
Micah, anything you want to weigh in there? I just see a lot of nodding, which feels great. That feels good.
Yeah, you know, I think Todd's covered it great. You know, especially for the stuff on wheels. I think the answer is, you know, different when it comes to not on wheels, and you just have to meet the minimum prescriptive package. I know Todd talked about the engineer, everything, but when you don't have it on wheels, you can meet prescriptive code. And what I mean by that is what is adopted in the code book. You don't have to get an engineer. Each jurisdiction is allowed to modify. It's chapter 3 of the residential code, and it's technically table 301.2, which gives their design criteria specific for their jurisdiction. So if you can construct your small space to meet your small dwelling unit to meet that design criteria for any jurisdiction and be a prescriptive code structure without having to get engineering. However, if it's on wheels, you're gonna have to go through Todd's method. But beyond that, you would not have to. And I did want to mention the thing about the skids, the wood skids. You technically could do that as an alternate design to the wood foundation. But again, that would have to go through the alternate methods and materials criteria under the administrative code, but it could be done. So I'm one of those, please look at the code as this is the bare minimum, and for you to be creative, it's not the absolute answer to everything you can do. You just got to approach your code official and go for it.
Yeah, what a problem solver. I think you've been at this for a while. Okay, there is another question that asked, do most city and county RV and mobile home parks allow tiny houses on wheels that are certified by, and I'm literally going to speak a foreign language now, Pacific West Associates, RADCO, RADCO, PFS TECO. Listen, I don't know what any of this means. And then it says, I know Grant County does. Well, way to go, Grant County. And hopefully someone understood what the heck I was saying.
Yeah, they're just third-party inspector organizations. There's a lot of them out there. There's a group even out of Florida called NOAA, National Association of Affordable Housing. They do third-party inspections over the phone, and you know, you could send your plans to them, and they do the making sure that wind loads and all engineering is achieved as well. Basic plan approvals, just like L&I would do, but L&I is by far way stricter, and you know, they're double checking everything. I mean, my plans at the RV and a park model level are now being viewed by the NTA ICC, National Code Council guys, so I have to have everything architecturally engineered, stamped, and then I send it to them, and then they approve the plan, and then it goes to L&I, and L&I approves the plan. So just because they're in an emergency cycle right now, plan approvals, they are behind and backlogged. But that being said, we're building safely, we're building to that level, and it's exciting to see these organizations doing this. But they're stamped, they're double architectural engineered stamped. It's crazy.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Yep.
So we don't have an onslaught of other questions, and I don't see anyone's hand up. Todd, I know we only have like 5 more minutes, but do
No.
you have an example of someone that sort of successfully built or building or has a tiny home or tiny house community that you could share with us? So like after this, when everyone's really inspired, they're like, I want to go read about someone that's done this successfully. Where could everybody go?
Yeah, so I'm going to share another slide here, but we developed this community in Puyallup, the lower picture there. We're filling it as we speak. I have like four vacancies right now. And the only reason we were allowed to get it done so quickly right after the bill was passed was basically that it was a mobile home park already, manufactured housing community, zoned R10, and just in 1996 it had flooded, and county, I'm on the flood control district with Pierce County, and we spent billions of dollars renovating and making sure the river had areas to flood into before it hit my park, which was nice of them to spend all that money just for me. But it gave us almost a clear bill of health to get units in there, but the county was like, no, we can't put mobile homes back in there. But anything with wheels works. So we have, around 75 vacant spots with current septic and utilities just sitting there waiting to be used, and finally found investors and told them about this goal, went and passed the bill and made sure all this got done just to give them a clear pathway. And the owners are still hesitant. They're like, Todd's kind of the expert on this, but we, go into the county, put us on speakerphone, make sure, Pierce County approves. And sure enough, they said the same thing they said to me 25 different times. And that was, yeah, anything on wheels can be placed down there. Even a park model RV, as long as it has a gooseneck style trailer or a pull behind trailer, can go 10, 12 feet wide even. So we've been moving them in, and there's a little picture of one just recently brought in. A guy built it. He builds veterans houses, and he went through the L&I process and built that structure. I'm still waiting to see if he got an approval. Nobody's providing me pathways to that. But that being said, the owner of the property can decipher what placement he wants, they want. Per se, when I developed this community, the owners asked me, what is your requirement? I said, I would like to make sure it's L&I certified to the tiny house codes, or if it has an RV certification, we'll take those. And that could be a third-party certification from NOAA or any of those organizations that person previously asked. And that really is dependent on the owners, as far as liability, insurance requirements, all of that kind of stuff. Having anything certified just means that someone is taking a little bit of the liability on those inspections. So that being said, that's a successful story for us. We got a single mom that lives over in Tri-Cities area, that she has a child that is full-time, lives at Children's Hospital in Seattle. And the commute was just too hard for them, so they wanted to go tiny and be more close to that child, and moved in the park. And the space rent is a little higher than I'd like to be at, $895 a month, but the spaces are gorgeous. There's a lot of amenities there. People are literally calling me saying that's okay. They like to pay more because it's a nicer place to live. It's very rural and along the river, and just in a community feel of the clubhouse and all of that. And the picture above is kind of a park that's been around a little while, and they even have some short-term rentals in there and stuff like that back east. And that's the goal, is to get them gorgeous, pretty, set apart, not really cramming them in there, and just in letting people develop the community. Right now we have a guy that's like, living there, and he said, I'll pay for a dog park to be installed. And we have people paying to do community gardens, and this is like a mobile home park where I think people are paying a little bit higher than I would like to pay. But for the opportunity to be somewhere legal and live without code enforcement contacting you and saying that, what is this, a unit, RV, or what is this, a tiny house, and why you need permits. That is coming down the line where these communities are being developed like this. And the county has actually approached us and talked about a master lease program for the rest of the spaces, maybe 40 spaces. They have 2 to 3 mobile home parks being shut down in the next year or two, and they're telling 40 people out of one mobile home park that be gone by October 1st. So they've approached
wow.
us and said, you know, you're the only company locally that could build a unit. Could you build these 40 units by the end of the summer and place them at your park down there at Bowman Hilton? And so we're talking to them. Section 8 has come down and said they'd actually potentially pay for the lot rent for the folks, so they would only have a mortgage payment. But $400 to $600 mortgage payment is pretty reasonable, right? For $100,000 tiny house. And it's coming down the road where we could build the 10 by 40s and kind of make it a 2 sleeping loft and 1 bedroom model. So, enough opportunity for folks with a bunch of kids. And just trying to provide a pathway to home ownership is a big key, but also a home that is under $200,000 is huge for folks.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you. We're right at our 2 o'clock time. Todd and Micah
Sorry.
are both really, really busy, but I do know we have one person with their hand raised. And then one more question in the chat, and then we're going to wrap it up. But so someone is just asking, like, looking at these pictures, are these licensed and ready for highway use? So you could transport them on the highway, right? Yeah.
Everything I build, everything that, when you build a tiny home on wheels, tiny house on wheels through L&I, that trailer comes with its license plate, its VIN number, and, hopefully they're using a tiny house trailer, not just something that they picked up. But the unit in the lower picture actually was built on an RV trailer, but he hired a welder. I inspected it myself to make sure could handle the weight, and it does a great job.
Great. All right.
Yeah.
So our last question is going to be from either Anna or Anna. So it looks like she's already off mute. So go for it.
Oh, you're muted.
Thanks, Mary. I was trying to add something to the chat at the same time. So I'm Anna. I'm the one that Todd spoke of, although it's not just for me that wants to live in a tiny house. I represent, we have 800 members in our Washington Tiny House Association, and I work with Todd to kind of clear up these kinds of questions with the members on a monthly meetup. And so far we have members that are in 20 of the 39 counties and 70 of the 490 towns and cities in Washington state. So in the chat box, I put our email address, and certainly Todd would be willing to have a Zoom chat with a jurisdiction about compliance with 5383 and 2001. So thank you.
Great.
Thank you all.
Perfect. Yeah. And when we send out the recording and the slides and things, we'll make sure that both Todd and Micah's contact information are available in there. So coming up next for Planning Association of Washington, we have a June webinar on equity and planning. In July, we'll be talking about creating viable funding strategies for small communities that need to build infrastructure. In August or September, we'll be presenting on creating a code that encourages development that pencils. And then in October, whatever spooky topic we come up with. So a special thanks to Todd and Micah, but also everyone that was able to attend today. Maybe if your cards are going well for Friday the 13th, maybe this is the last thing on your agenda, and now you can scoot off into your weekend and really enjoy it. So Todd and Micah, thank you again for being here with us, and thank you to everyone that was able to attend. Please enjoy your weekends.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Micah.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Todd. Thanks, Mary.
Honored to be here.